Digital Archiving, Journey from Triage to Enterprise. If you haven't had a chance to do so, please use the chat box at the right-hand side of your screen to let us know who you are, where you're from, and who's participating with you today. I'm Bonnie Weddle. I'm the coordinator of the Electronic Records Unit at the New York State Archives and the co-chair of the State Electronic Records Initiative's Education and Programming Subcommittee. As many of you know, the State Electronic Records Initiative is a multi-year Council of State Archivists effort that focuses on improving management, preservation, and access to state and territorial government electronic records in all 56 states and territories. And it is currently supported by a generous grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. As many of you also know, today's webinar is part of an ongoing series of webinars that provide practical advice, highlight tools and best practices, and explore digital preservation and electronic records management issues. Before I turn the floor over to today's presenter, I want to let you know that the next series webinar will take place on Tuesday, June 19th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Nick Canizzo of the Vermont State Archives will furnish an overview of blockchain technology and some of its implications and potential applications relating to public records. Registration information will be going out soon, so keep your eyes peeled. As in past years, there will be no series webinars in July or August because a lot of people are on vacation and the joint COSA SAA meeting is coming up. However, we do have several offerings in the works for this fall, so keep an eye on COSA's website, emails, and newsletters for more news. And now I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Marissa Bruns is the Digital Preservation Archivist at MIT Lincoln Laboratory, which is a federally funded repository that focuses on national security. If you have any questions for Marissa, please feel free to enter them into the chat box at the right-hand side of your screen. However, we are going to wait until the end of the presentation to answer those questions. Before I turn the floor over to Marissa, I have just one more thing to say. We usually host series webinars on Tuesday, and we're having this webinar on Friday because this is Marissa's day off work. So Marissa is doing this on her own time. So COSA owes Marissa a very big thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Marissa. Let me just transfer control of the slides here. And Marissa, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bonnie, and happy Friday, everybody. Thanks for joining me. My main goal today is to demonstrate how establishing a digital archiving program can be accomplished through an iterative development process, and that you can make a big difference with a lot fewer resources than you might think. The idea is to view your program development as an evolution in which you have to start somewhere and not let the perceived inability to achieve what is presented as ideal best practice keep you from acting. You should work from a strong understanding of core digital preservation concepts, standards, and best practices, but ultimately you need to translate those into practical solutions that are going to work for your unique organization and available resources. By iteratively developing your program over time, you can also use lessons learned to better inform your decision-making and dedicate limited resources to where they are needed most based on real experience. This presentation is geared towards smaller organizations with limited staff, budgetary, and technical resources looking for practical solutions, but I think it should be useful to larger organizations as well. It does assume a professional familiarity with basic digital preservation concepts, best practices, and technology, as well as foundational models and standards like OAIS and PAMIS. Given the amount of material we covered, I respectfully request you hold your questions until the end. With that, let's dive in. So just a little bit about me. I've been practicing digital archivist since 2002. And I've worked at a wide variety of archives, academic universities, scientific laboratories, philanthropic, family, and foundation archives, with varying degrees of available resources and technical support. In all cases, I was pretty much starting from scratch, implementing EAD, digitizing collections, managing collection management systems, and implementing digital preservation solutions. I was an early Archivematica beta tester, and I've served on steering committees for the SAA Archivist Toolkit Roundtable, BitCurator Software Development Committee, and the Best Practices Exchange. MIT Lincoln Laboratory, my current position, We are a federally funded research and development center that conducts research and development primarily for the Department of Defense. We have about 5,000 people, and the archive's users are primarily internal. Archival collections are comprised of organizational records created by and belonging to Lincoln Laboratory. We do not collect externally created personal manuscript collections. All access to archives collections, including finding aids, is mediated by an archivist. There's almost no direct patron access to any materials or metadata for security reasons. In terms of size, we're currently managing a digital collection of about 6 terabytes, so just shy of 2 million files and 4,000 digital media items. And to be clear, we are distinct archives entirely separate from MIT campus archives, although we are very fond of our colleagues there. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the kind of organization we are. So when I arrived at the laboratory about 5 years ago, they had started working on getting a digital archiving program off the ground, but only had half FTE dedicated to it, which was not enough to really move the program forward significantly. Much to my benefit, that person moved into the archives team lead position and successfully advocated for her former position to become a full FTE digital archivist position. This shift meant I was lucky enough to be able to fully dedicate my time to digital preservation and to start with an immediate supervisor who already understood digital preservation core concepts and what I was up against. But where to start? Because we all have to start somewhere. I was able to successfully advocate for 2 key components to our strategy that just sort of focused us in. So first, the born digital records on legacy media should take priority over any digitized content for which we have the original paper records. It's not that I don't care about those files and the resources it took to create them, but I know that they're not the record copy, they're already in stable formats, and they're safely backed up on servers already. Conversely, the born digital records are the record copies, and they're trapped on increasingly obsolete media with little to no intellectual control. The second main part of our strategy was that physical media is just a carrier, and it's a really bad solution for storing and managing digital records. It's risky and inefficient, 2 things I really don't like, and perhaps more importantly, it traps you in a never-ending cycle of labor-intensive and expensive media migration. Transferring all the digital records from their source media to one centralized server allows the archives to more economically, efficiently, and safely store and manage digital records. We still have to mitigate the file format obsolescence risk and manage the server technology, but at least the files are backed up automatically and they're in a centralized and highly accessible space where they can be processed, preserved, and made available to researchers without someone having to go into the vault and retrieve multiple pieces of media and then find working hardware to access that media. So those were sort of the kind of the foundation of our approach. And based on those 2 tenets, I quickly identified 2 key objectives. We wanted to establish basic intellectual control over the contents of our digital records in preparation for future processing and preservation, and transfer authentic copies of digital records from obsolete media and other laboratory systems to more secure archive systems. To prevent creating any more problems going forward, I immediately implemented standardized media identification, separation, and description procedures as part of our accessioning process. I also created an electronic media identification guide to help staff correctly identify incoming media, and established a digital media controlled vocabulary so the new description we were creating in the Archivist Toolkit would be consistent and therefore more reliably searchable. I then proceeded to inventory the legacy electronic media already in the archive's collections. I inventoried a little over 10,000 media items. And as a favor to my colleague, Colleen Cooney, who's our media specialist, I inventoried the analog media at the same time as the digital media because it was just more efficient that way. Every media item was separated from paper materials using separation forms and used unique accession number-based identification numbers to preserve their provenance, and then inventoried in an Excel spreadsheet. Maintenance of the inventory has been incorporated into standard operating procedure to ensure it remains accurate. And to give you some idea of that 10,000 media items, about 42% were recorded in digital formats, and the rest were analog media such as VHS or pneumatic videotapes. While conducting the inventory, I also tested multiple digital forensics, archiving, and preservation tools, developed an integrated workflow that linked those tools together into a process, and then set up the necessary hardware that would allow us to transfer authentic digital records to a centralized repository. That necessary hardware was based on a decision to prioritize the transfer of the following media types: 5¼ inch floppy disks, 3½ inch floppy disks, zip disks, jazz disks, and optical disks, CDs, DVDs, mini CDs. Rather than prioritizing our oldest media over our youngest, we actually chose to prioritize the media that was both most prevalent and also for which the necessary hardware to access it was reasonably obtainable. In other words, rather than spending significant resources on older media like 9-track tape with a dubious return on investment, we chose what would make the biggest difference in terms of quantity and quality of digital records saved. And by focusing on just those 5 media types, we were able to implement a transfer solution for roughly 82% of our digital media. In terms of infrastructure, for hardware, we started out with just an existing Dell Optiplex Windows 7 system and a salvaged American Megatrends 486 running MS-DOS 6.22. Thankfully, the lab is full of technological hoarders, and no one ever retires, which helped us acquire the 486. These two systems, combined with USB external zip and jazz drives, enabled us to access the 5 media types that we had prioritized. We used 2 previously purchased LaCie external hard drives as a temporary storage solution for the transferred files, while we secured the funding for the purchase of a dedicated NetApp storage server. So just starting out, we basically didn't have to spend any money at all just to set up this basic structure. I organized our approach into 3 stages aimed at addressing our 3 primary concerns, which were security, authenticity, and intellectual control. The authenticity and intellectual control pieces, I think, are pretty common at most organizations. We have a heightened focus on security, of course, because of the nature of the records that we handle. And this is how the workflow looks like when you it's grouped by those 3 stages, essentially. All the media from a single accession would be gathered and pushed through the workflow as individual transfers. So in the first stage, when we were focused on security, we would use McAfee On-Demand Scan and bulk extractor software on a disconnected computer to scan the records for malicious software and keywords that may indicate the presence of protected information not permitted on unclassified systems. We would then move into the authenticity stage using FTK Imager, MD5 Summer, and WinZip to create a logical disk image, generate checksums for each file, and transfer the files off the media. The checksum enabled us to verify the authenticity of the digital records throughout the rest of the triage process, as well as future processing and preservation activities. And then we moved into intellectual control, where we used Karen's directory printer and Archivist Toolkit to review the contents of the transfer, inventory the records selected for permanent retention, and document their official transfer into the archive's custody. We leveraged existing site licensed software, plus a few specialized open source applications and tools. So again, we didn't have to pay for anything at this stage. And this is what we ended up with. The final steps were structured according to Archivematica specifications because at the time we thought that was the digital preservation system we were most likely to use in the future. It also just made sense. The structure integrates the accession number and the electronic media ID numbers into the directory naming to preserve the provenance. It keeps all the archives created metadata and donor created digital objects separate from each other, keeps the digital files from individual media items separated and in their original order, and it keeps a zip file of the original transfer as a safety precaution in case anything goes wrong during submission. Aside from my own time, the entire system was implemented using a negligible amount of resources, no dedicated budget, limited technical support. Furthermore, we did it in compliance with several special security parameters and only used salvaged laboratory equipment that could be used for legacy hardware. Legacy media was all scanned for viruses, malware, and before we could bring it on to any of our systems. In order to meet laboratory security requirements, we also had to forego capturing disk images, although we originally had that in our workflow and we're using FTK Imager to do that. But requirements were that we not capture hidden and deleted files. So despite the strong emphasis in the literature on disk images as best practices, we were not comfortable with the fact that in most cases, the donor was no longer available to consult regarding transferring records that they intended to be deleted. Plus, the very concept of capturing hidden and deleted files seemed to us to counteract records management efforts to deliberately delete files. Finally, capturing blank file system space wasted our very limited archival storage space. So this decision is a prime example of where we deviated from recommended best practice because it did not make sense in our specific environment. And you have to be prepared to do that. So that was sort of our initial triage. It was really just focused on getting a sense of what all do we have and starting to get the records off of the old media and somewhere at least safer. After that, with that preliminary triage system in place, we were able to start rescuing the files off of legacy media. The files were safer and intellectual control was better, but access to the files was still pretty limited. As we pushed accessions through the triage workflow, we learned more about where we needed to go next. We then used our newly acquired knowledge and experience to build out a full proof of concept digital preservation system from SIP to APE. So first things first, we expanded our objectives. Our primary focus was on the first 5 bullets because those objectives could be met by the archives team with relatively minimal assistance from other laboratory teams and departments. Which is to say that at the proof of concept level, we felt that most of what we needed to reach those goals was under our control. The last 2 bullets involve more collaboration with and buy-in from colleagues external to the knowledge services team. I've always found that people are always the most challenging component of the development process, not the technology. To be successful, though, we need our partners to commit resources and our leadership to demonstrate preserving digital records as a value of the organization. So to scale up and acquire more resources to support the program over the long term, you can't neglect these 2 objectives. We also expanded our architecture model to better reflect the flow between components and incorporate the APE and the DIP at the end of the process, whereas triage was more just focused on creating a SIP. We kind of wanted to actually visualize taking it all the way through the process. And then we also, as the program and outreach efforts developed, we were able to expand hardware infrastructure, which allowed us to increase efficiency through multitasking, provide backup systems to mitigate security, quarantine delays, and expand legacy drives and software for accessing a wider variety of media and file formats. So we did actually make some small purchases of additional systems here, or in some cases inherited other equipment that was going to be salvaged. We basically set it aside so we could expand all the different things that we could access. And you'll notice that my machines all have mashed character names, and that's because I sit surrounded by computers all day, and it's much easier to refer to them by name than by property number. So I basically thought of doing, instead of medical triage, we're doing digital records triage. So, and in terms of software, our profile grew to support the expanded workflow and more file formats. So the majority of software remained open source with minimal site licensed or inexpensive proprietary applications. We introduced new applications like the Library of Congress's Bagger tool for creating APEs, PathLink checker, which is we use for anticipating problems with file paths exceeding 255 characters. QuickView Plus for easy review of multiple file formats in one viewer. That's one of the few proprietary applications we've actually purchased, but it was quite inexpensive and very worth it. IrfanView and Adobe Photoshop for batch migration of still image files. VLC Media Player, Media Info, and Real Player for working with moving image formats. And HTTrack Website Copier for web archiving. We started doing that as well. Originally, we started out using VirtualBox and BitCurator. In order to meet internal Information Service Department requirements, we were forced to switch to VMware Workstation Pro and a custom CentOS 6 VM, installing just the applications from BitCurator that we needed. And most of the functionality in BitCurator was actually based around you having a disk image, which we don't create. So in the end, we really didn't need a lot of the functionality there, so it wasn't too much of a loss. We also created our first custom scripts. I took a basic Linux programming course, and I solicited help from a library IT systems colleague to automate creating the SIP directory structures and checksumming, transferring, and verifying the files. And this is an example of where the iterative development approach paid off. By keeping careful records as I tested the process, I was able to identify the pieces of the workflow that would benefit the most from automation and dedicate our limited resources to improving their efficiency. So then this is what the new workflow looks like. We expanded them and aligned them also more closely to OAS and PAMIS. But we made a deliberate decision to deviate slightly to mirror our traditional distinction between accessioning and processing when working with paper records. Our previous triage workflow was adapted to become our submission or accessioning workflow, and we created a new ingest or processing workflow. And then within each workflow, there's additional 3 different stages. Once the submission accessioning process is complete, you end up with a raw, what we call a raw SIP, which sits in a queue before it's ingested and processed based on processing priorities. The ultimate goal is to make accessioning and processing of paper and digital materials simultaneous so that they can be processed within context of each other. And this idea of like a raw SIP versus what we then call a refined SIP is key. I think a lot of OAS sort of assumes you're getting this pretty package that is already ready to just go right into your digital preservation system. That has not been our experience. As with paper records, which frequently come to us in a messy box, the digital records are very similar, and they usually need a lot of work to be in a state where we're ready to actually ingest them into the repository. So this is the ingest process model. This is the piece where we think of as more as aligning with traditional processing of materials. Throughout the submission and ingest processes, the archives team works like a relay team, with individual team members focusing on different stages of the 2 processes. This approach has enabled the more tech-savvy team members to handle the technical tasks, and the team members with more knowledge of the collections and the finding aids to focus on processing, description, and access. This is what our archivable information package looks like once it goes through that workflow. It follows standard Library of Congress bag structure, but note that the original accession number and now the collection number are still incorporated into the directory naming structure to preserve that essential connection. And then once the APEs are stored, we audit them quarterly using another open source tool called Karen's Hasher. This is some a whole lot of detail, which you can review later if you download the slide deck, but it is a sample case that we selected to give you a glimpse at how a raw SIP can end up being split into multiple APEs and how those different APEs can require very different amounts of work. It also reiterates the key takeaway that we have never saved 100% and aim for perfection, but be realistic. Saving 90% is way better than doing nothing. So in this particular case, this accession was quite large. Once our processing archivist went in to process the materials, she discovered, as we do sometimes with paper, that there are actually 3 different collections here of different provenance, and they all required a different level of work depending on how big they were, how old the format or the files were, how many different formats are present. But the really positive thing to take from all of the work that went into these is that across all three, 6 format types accounted for roughly 90% of all the files, and they were plain text, PDFs, PowerPoints, JPEGs, Word docs, and Excel spreadsheets, all of which we are actually we can do something with. So overall, we had an extremely successful migration process, about 99.2%, and only about 0.08 failed to convert over into something accessible on modern technology. In general, the most difficult part of that second ingest workflow is the file format identification and conversion part. For security reasons, we are unable to directly exchange information with external format policies, so we've created our own local file format policy to document format name, file extension, format type, confidence level, preferred transformation paths, et cetera. So far we have encountered and documented 216 different extensions, each of which has been assessed for obsolescence risk and designated as high, medium, or low confidence. Due to limited resources and lack of robust batch migration tools at this stage, we currently only migrate files if they are considered low confidence. And also, we were surprised to find that using the file extensions has actually proven to be a more reliable indicator of format than we expected. We do run fits, and we get fits output, which is more precise, but it's hard to use without a way to batch manipulate all the information. It basically outputs an individual XML file for each file, which I can't possibly go in and open up and look at individually. So we actually rely pretty heavily on the file format extensions, and they've actually proven to be pretty accurate. Our experience with format characterization and migration has made it clear that we are currently unable to preserve and provide access to all formats equally. Rather than limit the formats we will accept, we have instead chosen to be transparent about our capabilities and manage our donor expectations accordingly by implementing digital preservation service levels. So that looks like this. Basically, these are incorporated into our transfer form requiring donor signature. For particularly large accessions, we have even provided preservation assessment reports detailing which aspects of the proposed accession will fall under which service level. So we're actively collaborating with our donors to identify and develop preservation solutions for our most common specialized formats so we can move them from basic level to enhanced level. But we are very transparent with them about what we're actually able to accomplish right now, and we take it all in, but we're clear with them about what they can expect us to do and sort of give back to them if they come looking in the future. Now that the digital records are much more discoverable and accessible, we've started developing policies and strategies for providing access to users. For security reasons, users do not have direct access to either the finding aids or the repository. All reference requests are therefore mediated by an archivist who conducts the search, reviews selected files page by page, and verifies the user's need to know and proper credentials, and then makes a DIP for the user. Depending on volume, restrictions, or file format, the user may need to visit the archives and review the selected files using QuickView Plus on a computer in our reading room, or we may just send them access copies, either through email or on disk. Any copies we send out of the archives are marked as archives access copies, so if they find their way back to us someday, we will be able to recognize them right away and discard them instead of ingesting them again. Word has also gotten around the lab, and we're starting to get sort of a different kind of reference request that usually goes something like, hi, I have some old PowerPoint files that I can no longer read through my modern PowerPoint software. I was told the library has old computers. Is that true? And might it be possible for me to bring my files to you and have you translate them to modern readability? So we do that as a service at the lab. And every time we've done it, it's resulted in some sort of acquisition for the archives. And it's a great teaching moment when they get to see how time-consuming it actually is to do this process. They hopefully go back with a more of an appreciation and come back to us later with more materials. So as I mentioned earlier, getting people to change is, in my experience, much more difficult than dealing with all that technology that I just talked about. Throughout the development of our digital archiving program, as we were drafting policy, creating workflows, implementing all these systems and software, and testing our processes, we were also doing what I like to call people triage. As we learned more and could demonstrate results, we increased efforts to communicate to stakeholders the challenges of digital preservation and the need for a laboratory-wide collaborative strategy for meeting those challenges. Building this foundation is essential to support future requests for additional resources. We started with just explaining why digital records present more challenge than paper records. We then went on to immediately follow up with explaining why preservation is not solved by just buying more server space and backing all the files up there indiscriminately. You have to do considerably more than that to ensure the digital records are discoverable, trustworthy, and accessible to researchers in the future. And that, getting that message across, that it requires not only the hardware and software to access the files and the media that they're stored on, but also the ability to prove that the files have not been modified in any way from their original content has been key. We have actually, once we sold them on those first 2 points, we then had to explain why meeting our objectives required a combined effort on the part of information creators, archivists, technologists, security personnel, and administrators. To maximize the useful digital records preserved, we need to improve what's happening before the files come into our custody. We need a two-pronged approach involving improved digital content management while the information is still in the hands of its creators, as well as enhanced digital preservation capabilities within the laboratory archives. We've had some success with this message in that we have received approval to start a new team and hire knowledge managers to lead a digital information management effort. Unfortunately, we still have not been able to get a revised version of our laboratory administrative procedure for archives that specifically includes the mandate for preserving and providing access to laboratory records, regardless of format, approved by laboratory leadership. But we keep moving forward anyway. We're now at our next stage of iterative development. We've learned a lot in the last 5 years about our legacy media collection, but along the way, we also had to handle new accessions of born digital records not transferred to us on physical media. The nature of these new accessions has significantly shaped our next set of objectives. On the smaller end of the spectrum, our proof of concept system works for new accessions. We were able to handle that one accession that I showed you as a test case. But the workflow starts to break down in places when you start to scale up significantly over that. So if all you're dealing with are legacy media, then that sort of proof of concept system works just fine. It's not necessarily the most elegant or efficient solution, but it works and it gets the job done. But to deal with what's coming, we're going to have to scale up along with the collection. So a few years ago, a project team approached us about archiving a file share from a level 1 program that had ended. When we met with them to take a closer look, we found this. Comparatively speaking, that other ingest test case we looked at was 132 gigs and 32,000 files. This one's 811 gigs and over 200,000 files. At the time, we didn't have the infrastructure in place to handle such a large accession, so we decided to use it as a learning opportunity. The program lead agreed to lock down permissions to read only and hold the files in place for 5 years on the server to give us time to expand our architecture. But during those 5 years, we agreed to conduct a preservation assessment of the files to identify any formats that we considered potentially problematic from a preservation perspective. We would then work together to address those concerns. It took over a year due to limited project team resources. I was able to get about an hour once a month with one particularly dedicated program team member. The effort was worth it because it gave us a sneak preview of what we could expect to see in terms of program-level accessions in the future in regards to scale, organization or lack thereof, duplication, file format variety, and supporting documentation and metadata, or lack thereof, again. We also expect proposed knowledge management initiatives to generate an uptake in acquisitions, and we need to make existing workflows more efficient to free up time to tackle preservation solutions for more complex format types like CAD drawings or software code. Based on 5 years of experience, we acknowledge that the proof of concept model will not scale up sufficiently to handle large-scale format characterizations and batch normalizations. It also lacks a robust enough audit trail from beginning to end to satisfy our goals for trustworthiness. We've not been able to implement a solution to regularly audit the fixity of SIPs, for example. To address these issues and accommodate accessions on this scale that's coming, we need an enterprise solution. And what we mean by that is essentially this. We need laboratory leadership supported mandate and a comprehensive stakeholder collaboration. We need proactive, centralized digital information solutions. We need scalable, interoperable, and integrated systems with dedicated IT support. We need less manual and more semi-automated processes. And we need aggregated, accessible metadata that can be manipulated and used to guide preservation actions. And we need a continuous and secure audit trail. In February 2016, we formed a systems selections team to select a new collection management system and a digital preservation system to replace the aging Archivist Toolkit database that was no longer supported, and to enhance the functionality, the scalability, and the trustworthiness of our currently implemented proof of concept digital preservation system. Both types of systems were evaluated simultaneously to provide potential benefits in terms of system integration and cost savings by purchasing software as a bundle. Based on a survey of available options, recommendations from colleagues, and conference demonstrations, we identified 9 collection management systems and 9 digital preservation system options. Using documentation review, web demos, customer references, each option was evaluated against a thorough list of criteria, ranging from archival functionality, system administration, financials, and that document's actually shareable. If you're interested, you can ping me. We can share that with you. But in the end, we decided to work with Menisys, which is a Canadian company. They were the only organization that we found that could really offer us an integrated collection management, digital preservation system, and a MWI, which is their web interface solution, all in one. And they've been great to work with. So far, we've completed phase 1, where we've implemented the collection management system and migrated all of our records out of Archivist Toolkit and into the M2A, their collection management system. And now we're in the process of implementing what they call right now, they call it a TDR, but it's their digital preservation system. And then the third phase will be implementing the web interface that will basically bring the archival description out of M2A and the links to the digital assets in the TDR into one web interface where we can search and find both our paper and our digital records all within the context of each other. One of the things we love the most about the system is that it was designed for people with minimal technical expertise. So I have basically been able to do just about everything with their, with their guidance and their training without needing dedicated IT support. And it's also incredibly customizable, which we love. And it was a very cost-effective solution, being able to buy all 3 pieces as a bundle. So this is what our OAS local model is starting to look like, with Our data management being taken care of by M2A, our collection management system, which we've already implemented. And now we're implementing the TDR, the archival storage piece. And then in phase 3, we'll be implementing the MWI web interface and also additional functionality for bringing records in from the producer. And our architecture now looks like this. So we've actually got multiple Windows 2012 VM servers and multiple different NetApp storage volumes, all 3 of them dedicated to storing the raw SIP, which is really more of a working space. And then once they're refined, they'll go on to a new storage volume while we wait to ingest them into the TDR. And then the TDR will output the APEs, which will get stored on their own separate storage volume. In terms of enterprise technical support, I'm still begging for this. And you can accomplish a lot with limited technical support, especially if you're willing and able to expand your own skill set. In some cases, you may be able to find colleagues willing to help you accomplish specific tasks or troubleshoot a technical problem, even if they can't provide sustained technical support. Specific application user forums and professional listservs can also be really helpful. Everything that we've accomplished up to this point has been with pretty limited technical support. We might be able to get Information Services Department to stand up a server for us or create the virtual machines, but then everything after that is pretty much us. So installing the new collection management system was all me with someone from Anisis on the phone talking me through it step by step. It's been very much an iterative development process, and we faced a lot of challenges along the way. We figure out where we need to dedicate more resources, build out more infrastructure, and improve efficiencies as we go. It's important to keep the ideal in front of you, but not let the challenges and the setbacks of reaching that ideal halt progress. We still have a long way to go. We conduct annual assessments using both the digital preservation capability and maturity model and the trustworthy repositories audit and certification auditing tools. And we use those assessments to project priorities and action items over the next 5 years. We often make progress where we didn't expect it, and we fail to meet objectives we thought we would be easier than others. And each year, we just adjust the plan accordingly, and we keep moving forward where we can. I believe the single most important quality you can have as a digital archivist is persistence, not technical expertise. Someone willing to learn can be taught technical skills, but if you're the sort of person who gives up easily at the first frustrating roadblock, then you might want to consider a different profession. I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions and let you know that you can contact me. I am more than happy. There's a lot of content in this slide deck. I highly recommend downloading it. I have sat for an hour over the phone and walked people through the workflows step by step, and we're more than happy to do that. We're also more than happy to share. A lot of the documentation we've created has been approved for public release, so our file format policy, our preservation service level document, all of our workflows are all things that I can share with you. If you're interested, you can just email me. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Bonnie, and then I think we're going to open it up for questions.
Okay. Well, Marissa is excuse me, transferring control of the slides back over to me. I am going to do what I did not do at the very start, and that is give Marissa a fuller introduction. I was working from a printout, and I didn't realize until I started looking at it just how screwed up the margins were. Marissa, as she said, is the Digital Preservation Archivist at MIT Lincoln Laboratory, which is a federally funded research and development center that applies advanced technology to problems of national security. Her responsibilities and research interests include developing practical solutions and strategies for lifecycle digital information management, preservation, and access using open source technology. Marissa is a graduate of Indiana University Bloomington's Master of History and Master of Library Science programs, as well as the University of Arizona's Digital Information Management Graduate Certificate Program. She's previously worked at the Philanthropic Archives of the Rockefeller and Gates families and foundations, as well as the Northeastern University Archives and Special Collections and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution Archives. She's also served, as she said, as a steering committee member for the SAA Archivist Toolkit Roundtable. And if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box at the right-hand side of your screen. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, I'd just like to take a moment to encourage you to complete the evaluation form that's going to pop up on your computer screen when you leave this webinar. The Education and Programming Subcommittee really does review these evaluations, and we do take them into account when planning future webinars. So please help us help you by taking a couple of moments to complete the survey. Thank you. Any questions?
Even if you don't have a specific question, if there's one slide you want me to go back and pay more attention to, if you want me to walk you through workflows or something like that, that's also an option.
Okay, there is one question that's come in. Linda from Pennsylvania would like to know, did you ever go back and convert the oldest media, and did it change or impact your workflow at all?
No, we're still focused just on those formats that I had listed. I think our next media that we're going to tackle, trying to find a solution for, are Data 8 tapes. At this point, we basically try to prioritize where we think we're going to get the most bang for our buck, really, in terms of, if we're going to spend the time and effort to figure out a solution, that we want to make sure we're going to get a lot out of it. And we still have the 9-track tapes in our collection, but the chances are that even if we can find a solution to get the data off of them, we're pretty skeptical that it's going to be anything usable at this point.
Okay, while we wait for questions to come in, I know not everybody in the world is the quickest typist. I just wanted to encourage all of you to stay informed and connected to COSA. Let's see. Okay. Please check out COSA's website and Resource Center, Twitter feed, Facebook page. As I mentioned at the start of this webinar, we're going to be publicizing the fall slate of CIRI webinars via all of these resources. Later this year, you'll find information about Electronic Records Day and some new CIRI-produced resources for state archives. In addition, you will find webinar recordings and slide decks available for download. And the slide deck and recording for this webinar should be up shortly. We do have another question from Mary. You indicate that you had limited IT support, but did IT throw up any roadblocks that have made your work more difficult?
Oh, so yeah, so the lab, one of the things that drives me crazy is that our Information Services Department is very much on top of updating all the software that the laboratory uses to make sure that they're on top of any security, potential security vulnerabilities. So they're constantly pushing upgrades to software, and I don't have any control over that. And so there have been multiple occasions where they have pushed an upgrade and it's changed something about how the software works that breaks my process. Well, for example, they just upgraded all of our McAfee software, and I used to be able to go in and open up a little GUI to create, to run a scan on the disk, and I could tell it to put a little text report in my metadata folder so I could document that I ran the virus scan and what the results were. And now that's completely gone, and I had to figure out a different way to basically document that. So that has been frustrating. But I don't really have any control over that, and I just have to make the best of it, and when it happens, figure out a new solution.
And Marissa, if you don't mind my saying so, Marissa and I were chatting before the webinar began, And those of us in state government are very often confronted with IT departments that impose some pretty tight restrictions on what you can use, what you can download, so on and so forth. And Lincoln Laboratory is a little more flexible, but you just don't get a lot of support. Say if you want to explore an open source tool, yeah, you can download it, yeah, you can explore it, but you're on your own.
Yeah, it's like they won't stop me. If I download open source software, I can install it after I virus scanned it. They won't stop me from installing it, but no one's going to help me figure out how to use it, or if it breaks, help me figure out what the problem is. They don't, if they don't support it, we're pretty much on our own. So, yeah.
Okay. Douglas would.
I think we have some more questions.
Yeah, we do. First off, Linda from Pennsylvania would like to know, do you use Menisys Cloud or on-premises solution? If cloud, was connectivity relatively simple or blocked by your network?
Yes, so we are actually going to be Menisys' guinea pig for an on-site solution. I think all their other clients use cloud. We cannot use cloud services for security reasons. So yeah, where they're figuring out how to do an on-site solution for us. So they'll already have figured that out whenever anybody else needs that.
Okay, and Douglas would like to know if you can discuss your consideration of open source versus proprietary software when you were conducting your evaluations of available software.
Absolutely. So I've always been a huge proponent of open source software. Mostly because I was usually working somewhere where I had no budget and couldn't afford to buy anything. So, but in this case, we did try to stand up Archivematica. We spent about a month, me and one of my colleagues from the library side of things, and we were able to get it up and running, but we could not get a SIP through it. And it kept getting hung up, it kept failing, we couldn't figure out why, there was no reporting that would help us explain what was going on. We tried to get some help on the forum, and we got a little bit of help, but then they basically were like, well, you have to purchase our support agreement if you want us to help you figure out what's going on. So at that point, we were like, yeah, no, forget this. So, and that's part of it. Like sometimes, with this iterative development process, you try things that don't work out, and you kind of have to figure out when you need to just cut your losses and move on and look for another solution. And so when it came around to doing the selection process, we pretty quickly just eliminated all of the open source tools like Fedora and iRods, and all of which are great systems, but we just don't have the IT support to implement. That weighed more heavily, I think, than a lot of our other criteria on finding a solution, and why we ended up with Menisys, because their systems were specifically designed for organizations that don't have a lot of tech support. There's so much that you can do and customize without having to know any programming code. And also, they were just super supportive, and everyone we talked to that had worked with them, they've been in business for 40 years, spoke very highly of their customer service. So yeah, so we ended up with a proprietary solution. And I've gone through software selection processes at pretty much every organization I've ever worked at, and I think we've chosen something different every time, because it's really about what works best for your particular organization with the resources you have available. There are lots of good systems to choose from, but they're not all necessarily right for you.
Okay, any other questions? Just going to give folks a couple of minutes to type here. I inadvertently cut somebody off in March, and I don't want to do that a second time. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I just wanted to say a lot of us here on this webinar are state government, and I was so happy to hear you say that you consciously consciously drew a distinction between organizations that might take, personal papers, in digital format from individuals versus a repository that gets stuff via a records management program. You know, one of the reservations I've always had about BitCurator is, you know, I don't want anything coming through my doors that isn't covered by a record schedule. And, you know, I want the files that the schedule tells me that you're going to send me. You know, I don't want your digital stuff.
Yeah, and that's, you know, I was at, I think, a BitCurator software user group meeting, and me and Kelly Eubank, who used to be the state archivist at North Carolina, both left that, you know, just so frustrated because we were the only ones that were just like, no, digital images don't work for us. Like, we don't want all this stuff that, you know, is supposed to get deleted, and we don't want hidden and files, and we don't, you know, like, and we were just, it was funny. I've had lots of conversations with Cal Lee about disk imaging and in an organizational environment, as opposed to, like, if you're going out and trying to image someone's system at home and bring in their manuscript records. You know, it's just a different situation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's been a couple of minutes, and I'm not seeing any additional questions. If you do have any additional questions, I purposely moved the slide deck so that you'll have an opportunity to copy down Marissa's contact information. If questions come to you later, you can access the webinar recording and the slide deck via the Council of State Archivists website. Marissa, is there anything you'd like to say in conclusion, or should we just wrap this up?
Just thanks for everybody's time.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you in particular for doing this on your day off.
No problem.
Okay, everybody. I hope you have a lovely weekend. Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you back next month.